you probably need good weapons. So they became a little bit more receptive to these Europeans coming along. And again, the Patuxent Village had approximately 2,000 people in the 1610s, which is the village that Squanto came from. So now let's get to Squanto. In 1590, Tisquantum, or Squanto as we know him, was born in Patuxent. We don't know the exact date. We just know it was sometime around 1590. He grew up like any other Native American little boy would, learning to fish, to hunt, probably learning to fight. In 1602, the French and English expeditions entered the area searching for a potential colony site. So both the French and the English had come to the New England coast near this Patuxent village, and they were looking for somewhere to put a colony. At this point, the Great Dying has not happened. So remember, the Wampanoag are not going to let them stay for a long period of time. They're not going to find a site where they can really start a new colony at this point. In 1611, an expedition is dispatched by Sir Ferdinand Georges. In this expedition, which is along Martha's Vineyard, 3 Noopi Wampanoags are seized. The Noopi would be another village. So 3 Wampanoags are seized and taken to London. One of these is Epinow, who was a powerful Sachem. A Sachem is a chief. So he's kidnapped, he's put on a boat, he's taken across the ocean to London. He realizes that the Europeans are wanting gold. So he tells them about this wonderful gold that is back home. There was no gold. Epinow was not stupid. He told them what they wanted to hear so he could stay alive. Okay. So in 1614, John Smith, how many of you have heard of John Smith before? You didn't know he was up in New England, did you? You thought he just did Jamestown? No. Remember in Jamestown, he gets hurt and he has to go back to England? Well, after he recovers, they send him back to do some exploring for him, but it's up in the New England area. So John Smith and a man named Thomas Hunt are sent back to the New England region, but they find no gold. Epinow knew that. By the way, Epinow is going to be another Native American who's going to make his way back to his homeland. So Smith tells Captain Thomas Hunt, when they can't find the gold, I'm going to go look up and down the coastline a little bit more. You stay here and fish. Fill your boat with fish, because we don't want this to be a total wasted trip. Fill your boat with fish, and then we'll sail back to Malaga, Spain, and sell the fish. Well, Hunt has a different idea. He thinks that he can make more money off of slaves than he can fish. So he tricks about 20 Wampanoags from the Patuxent village, including Squanto, into coming on the boat. He gets them on the boat, and he locks them in the cargo hold. And he sails across the ocean to Malaga, Spain. Now, when Smith finds out about this, he condemns Hunt for doing it, but it's too late. He can't stop him. Hunt gets to Malaga, Spain, and he begins to sell his native captives. Squanto is probably around 12 years old at this point. Maybe a little older, somewhere. He's somewhere in his teen years. But Squanto is sold not to someone who wants him as a slave, but he's sold to a group of monks. The monks have pooled their money together. They've gone to the slave market and they buy as many slaves as they can and set them free. Squanto is given his freedom. Well, that sounds great, but he's in a foreign land. He doesn't speak the language. He doesn't know anybody. It's completely different from what he grew up with. What's he going to do? Where's he going to go? Well, for a while, he's going to live with the monks. And Squanto seemed to have this great gift for learning languages because he picks up their language very quickly. He's very linguistically talented. The monks, however, realize that he really wants to go home. He's homesick, just like any of us would be. And so they start to try and figure out how they're going to get him home. They don't have the money to put him on a ship and send him back. But what they do have the money to do, what they are able to do, is send him to London, England. So they get him to London, England, where he begins living with a man named Slaney. So in 1616, the monks have helped him get to London, and he's living with John Slaney, who just happens to be an investor in a leading trading company. Okay, trading companies during this time are the ones who are sending people over to make colonies and to trade with the Native Americans. So Slaney is going to have access to ships that are going back and forth to the New World from London. And that's where Squanto just happens to wind up. And because he's talented linguistically, he picks up English quickly and fluently. In 1617, Slaney and some other investors send Squanto on an expedition to Newfoundland as a translator and a diplomat. And you're like, wait a minute, why are we in Canada? This is the history of the American Thanksgiving. Well, yeah, but at the time, Canada was part of the New World, and England had colonies or was trying to establish colonies there. So were the French, which is going to lead to another conflict later. But at this point, it's all one and the same. So Squanto is sent to Newfoundland as a translator and a diplomat. Now, there's a man that was already in Newfoundland named Thomas Dermer. And he meets Squanto. He knows of Squanto's story at this point, and he begins working alongside Squanto. Dermer knew that Squanto wanted to get back home as well. And so what happens next is in 1619, Dermer and Squanto are sent to the New England area to search for a site for a colony. So Squanto is now back home. He's not only just in the general area, he is literally back in his home. He runs to his village. Can you imagine the excitement he's got? Mom, Dad, I'm home. I made it. He gets to the village and it's empty. It's not just empty. There's no sign of life there, and there's no sign that life has been there for years. You see, all of Patuxent was wiped out by the Great Dying. Everybody he knew and loved was gone. What a homecoming. So he goes and he lives by himself in the woods for a little while. But that's not going to be a way to survive. So in 1619, he begins living in the village of Massasoit, who is another of the Wampanoag Sachems. He's a chief. Now, Massasoit does not fully trust Squanto. Squanto has spent a lot of time in Europe. He speaks the white man's language. So Massasoit, he's going to let Squanto live with him, but he's never fully going to trust him because of the European influences. So something happens in 1620. Can you guess what happens in 1620? The Puritans or the Pilgrims arrive in Plymouth. Now, you will notice that I use the term Puritans more often than I use Pilgrims. Pilgrim is a term that just means that you're on a journey. The majority of the people who came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1620 were Puritans. Puritans or separatists were English men and women who had broken away from the Anglican Church because they said the Anglican Church had become too worldly, basically. They wanted to purify, hence the name Puritans, the English church or the Anglican Church. Now, the Puritans have been on a journey themselves. They're being persecuted in England. They leave England. They go to Denmark for a while. And they have religious freedom there, but their children start becoming more Danish than English. And they don't like that. So they come up with this idea that if they go to the New World, they can raise their children to be good Englishmen and godly people. So they go back to England for a while, get to make all the arrangements, get the backing they need to come and establish this colony. So in 1620, the Puritans arrive in Plymouth after a very harrowing voyage over the sea. I encourage you to look into what the Puritans actually went through to be able to come to the New World before they even got here. So they arrive in Plymouth and they settle right on Squanto's old village site. Literally the same ground. All right, that's great. There's somebody else here in this village. They've made it across the ocean. They're excited. They're going to have their religious freedom. But do you know when they made it across the ocean? Do you know when they landed? November 9th of 1620. What's the problem with that? Yeah, we're talking New England. We think it's cold out there tonight. Yeah, it's cold. Have they been able to plant any crops? The voyage took longer. They were delayed. The voyage took longer than they thought. So they're not going to have a lot of provisions left on the ship. They have no shelter. Because remember, the Native Americans that used to live at that site, they had died out a while before. Any shelters that were there were dilapidated and run down. And a good Englishman wasn't going to live in a wigwam anyway. Okay. So, they're still facing quite an uphill battle. There were 102 pilgrims or Puritans that arrived in 1620. At 1621, half the Puritans had died during the winter. By the feast, you had 22 men left, 4 married women left, and 25 children, ranging in age from baby to adolescence. That's it. At 1621, half the Puritans have died during the winter, and they are still, the ones that are surviving, are malnourished and weak with little to no food. This is a great uplifting story right before Thanksgiving, isn't it? So what happens? Well, during the winter, Massasoit's been watching them. Remember, the Wampanoag don't like for you to stay a long time, but they've also suffered that great dying. They need a new ally. So Massasoit's watching. He sends Samoset in the spring of 1621, who is a Sachem from a neighboring village, to make contact with the Puritans. Now, Samoset knew some English. from encountering the European or the English fishermen. He was not fluent in English, but he knew some English. And remember, I said that Massasoit does not fully trust Squanto. So even though he has somebody who's fluent in English, he's not going to send him right away because there's a lack of trust there. So he sends Samoset. Samoset goes in and he has some pretty successful interactions with the Puritans. He comes back and he tells Massasoit, you need to let me take Squanto. Squanto's going to understand better. He's going to be able to communicate better with them because his English is much better. And so Massasoit agrees for Squanto to go with Samoset. And in 1621, spring of 1621, Squanto goes in and he's able to broker a peace conference and a treaty between the Wampanoag and the Puritans. The Wampanoag are now going to let the Puritans stay. They think they found their new ally. Now, before you think that everything was just peachy keen and there was no problems with any other Native American tribes or there were no issues even between the Wampanoag and the Puritans, that's not, I don't have time to go into every detail of everything that happened. What I can tell you is that Squanto becomes very valuable to both the Wampanoag and the Puritans in keeping that peace and communicating. He also assists in communicating with other neighboring tribes and trying to keep peace. But there were some things that happened along the time. And the Puritans had some rather mischievous children too, from time to time. There's some good stories about those. Like one of them gets lost in the woods for like 3 days, gets picked up by another tribe and held prisoner. And it's all kinds of fun. His brother had accidentally discharged a musket on the Mayflower, which could have sank the ship. So I'm totally destroying your idea of these great, perfect, pious people, aren't I? Anybody who ever told you history is boring did not actually, all they did was read facts and figures. They didn't actually read stories. Read the stories. So Squanto comes in and he continues to live with the Puritans after this peace treaty is brokered. I mean, they're living on his homeland anyway. He's got some experience with the English. They're not completely new to him. He's never really felt at home with Massasoit's village. So he continues to live with the Puritans. And he teaches them how to fish, how to hunt game, how to hunt eels. He teaches the boys how to go on the beach and stomp on the mud to find the eels. Now, I think that would be a job that most young boys would enjoy doing. He teaches them to plant corn, squash, and beans, which is called the Three Sisters. The Native Americans were the ones who would plant those. They called them the Three Sisters, and wherever you found one, you found the other two. And they planted them so that the squash and the beans would grow up the stalk of corn. And they nourished the ground. Each one put nutrients back into the ground that the other one was taking out. So he teaches the Puritans how to do all of this. So in November of 1621, they have a 3-day Thanksgiving celebration to God for a bountiful harvest. They're eating for 3 days. They're playing games. They're having shooting contests. They are just celebrating. Could you imagine a 3-day Thanksgiving celebration? I mean, you're not just sitting down the one day and having all that good food. You get to do that for 3 days. I do feel sorry for the 4 Puritan women, the four Puritan women that were left. 90 Wampanoag Indians or Native Americans come and join that feast, and they've been invited to the feast. They bring 4 deer with them. And they said that the accounts say that the Puritan men went out and hunted fowl and brought back enough to feed the entire colony for a week. Squanto continues to live with the Puritans and act as a translator and a diplomat. Now, lest you think that Squanto is perfect, he does try and play the Native Americans and the Puritans against each other. He realizes his great position. He realizes that peace really depends on him and his translation. And there are times that he tells the Puritans, well, you know, they're getting ready to attack you. Or he'll tell the Native Americans, the Puritans are thinking about attacking you, to keep both sides wanting him to broker the peace between them. It was a bit of a power play. So he's not this great and perfect man. But if you think about everything he's been through, you can kind of understand, maybe not excuse, but understand why he would do that power play. Yeah. So there's even one point where he makes Massasoit so mad from this playing one against the other that Massasoit demands that William Bradford have hand Squanto over to be executed. Bradford was pretty fond of Squanto, but to keep the peace, he was really contemplating it. Ultimately, he does not hand Squanto over. Unfortunately, in November of 1622, Squanto contracts Indian fever and dies. We don't know what Indian fever was. We do know that he bled from his nose. We do know that Native Americans believed that when you bled from your nose, it meant death. It was a sign of death. And certainly in Squanto's case, it was. He was probably around 32 years old. He was in his early 30s. According to William Bradford, who was with Squanto when he died, he says in his journal of Plymouth Plantation that Squanto's last words, he says that he prayed that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven, and he bequeathed sundry of his things to sundry of his English friends as remembrances of his love. Now, that's very old English. Basically, what he's saying is Squanto said to him, hey, pray that I will go to your heaven, to your God. And by the way, all my possessions, you can distribute them among my friends, the Puritan friends. Now, we only have Bradford's account, and asking Bradford to pray that he would go to heaven is not the same thing as necessarily as a salvation experience. We also have to remember the Puritans, and they were very Calvinistic. They believed in predestination, so we don't have a definitive thing that says Squanto received Christ before he died, but he certainly had heard the word. And this would seem to indicate that his desire was to spend eternity in heaven with, as he put it, the Englishman's God. Now, the story of Squanto, like I said, it's not necessarily an uplifting story. But if you put it in context with the story of the Puritans, I think you can see God's provision. Yes? So, remember that work part I told you about? I want you to take just a couple minutes with the people at your table, and if there's nobody at your table, you can find somebody who is at your table or work alone. Take a few minutes, and on that last page in your handout, you'll notice there's a heading and then it's blank. I want you to work together and identify some examples in Squanto's story of God's provision. And I'm just going to give you about 2-3 minutes to do that real quick. And then we'll discuss some of the ones that you might have found.
He had to be speaking to his heart. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to give you probably about another 30 seconds to wrap it up, and then we'll discuss it together. Okay, are we ready? All right. So, what did you come up with? Somebody just shout something out for me.
Food.
Food. Okay, what do you mean?
God provided the needs for the individual people
Okay.
to nourish their bodies.
Yep. He used Squanto to help them learn how to cultivate the land and provide food for them, both immediately and for the future. Okay, what else?
Ability to learn the other languages to help.
Yes. Yes, he had to be very talented to pick those languages up that quickly because we're only talking about him being in Europe a few years. Okay, so it usually takes a lot longer than that to become fluent in another language.
God's provision work through the slavery part.
Mm-hmm.
Been left behind and died when great food.
Yeah.
But God placed him.
Yeah.
In a place where he could use it.
God, and see, God's provision doesn't always look the way we think it's going to look. Squanto was saved from the great dying by being sold into slavery.
He had favor from God because God gave him protection.
Yes. God protected him multiple times. Multiple times. Is there a certain person in the Bible that Squanto's story kind of parallels? Joseph. Yeah. In a lot of ways, he's Joseph. Okay. let's take a look at some of the ones that I found. And these by no means are all of them. Okay. And you may have gotten some of these. You certainly got the first one. Squanto being kidnapped and sold into slavery saved him from the great dying. You got the second one, that he learned English and other languages very quickly. God's provision was with the monks for Squanto being saved from slavery. Otherwise, he would have probably died even earlier from the hard work. Because one thing about early slavery, especially the Spanish, it was cheaper to replace a slave than take care of them. So they would literally work them to death. Okay. The great dying created a need of the Wampanoag, created a need by the Wampanoag for an ally. And I think I heard somebody in your discussion say that God had to speak to the heart of the chief to allow the Puritans to stay. This was a part of it. He created the conditions that would make it more beneficial. Squanto living with Slaney, who just happens to be one of those investors who's going to be sending ships back and forth. The Puritans just happen to settle on the old village of Patuxent. Okay, these are just some of them. Just some of them. And if you continue to think on the story, I'm sure you'll think of more. But God's provision doesn't always look like we think it's going to look. Certainly the story of Squanto, when you first look at it, if you don't have a biblical worldview, you're not going to think, God really provided there. You're probably going to think, man, what a poor individual. How sad it is for his life to have been all that. Yet he was used by God. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, I think too, he probably shared what he had learned from the monks about God to the other,
to Massasoit and the
individuals, the people of his tribe.
I'm sure he at least told them what he had been told, which may have played into their distrust of him. But at least he shared it, which meant that even more people in his culture were exposed to the gospel. Okay. And he certainly had come across true examples of Christ-like love in those monks. I hope that this today, because I could stand up here for like another 2 hours and go on and on and on about this, and we could have conversations and I would just be giddy. But you guys have other things to do tonight. So, but I hope that this has helped you see that, one, it's important to study history. History's not boring. It's interesting, and it's important to study it. I hope it's helped you learn how to study history the proper way. And I hope it has mostly helped you see that God's provision is throughout history. You just have to look for it. Sometimes it's blaringly obvious. Sometimes it's not. Ask me sometime about Washington and the Revolutionary War and how God provided for him and our troops. Those are really cool stories too. Well, I thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody has. But right now I'm going to turn it back over to Pastor and let him close us out with prayer.